Good morning. Thank you once again for joining us on our Sunday morning video service. It's great to have you all join us, and we appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I don't have very many things to cover this morning. As usual, our men's meeting meets at 6:30 on Monday nights on Zoom. If you'd like to be a part of that, let Pastor Carl or Pastor Carlos know, and they'll get you hooked up with that. Our ladies group has resumed Thursday nights at 6:30 on Zoom. If you'd like to be a part of that, let Deanne Paradis or myself know, and we can get you hooked up to be a part of it. We're going to study characters in the Bible, so if you're interested in that, please let us know. We'd love to have you join us. This is Mission Sunday this week, so you know the drill. You can go to thefathershouse.org, click on the giving button, set it up as a one-time gift or a recurring gift, and give to our missions in Argentina and India that way. You can mail a check to the Father's House at 133 Bernal Road, San Jose, California, 95119. Or if you live in the area and you'd like Pastor Carl and I to come by and pick up your tithes, we'd be happy to do that. Just give us a call and let us know. And once again, thank you for your generosity on your giving. We know it's tough for some people, but we also know that it's a responsibility that God gave to us to keep the lights on at the Father's house. So thank you once again. That being said, I guess we'll turn the time over to our guest speaker, John Mark, and see what he has to teach us this week about the life of Jesus Christ and how it changed him and how it can change you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Father's House. It's good to be back with you again today. As always, it's great to be here. And I trust that you've had yourself a great week this week during the summertime and enjoying your summer and enjoying your family, which is the most important things in all of life. As Pastor Penny mentioned, my name is John Mark. I go by the name of Mark, and it's true that I was a follower of Jesus Christ in the early days of his ministry. And then I wrote an account of his life, which is entitled The Gospel According to Mark. I would be Mark. And I was the one that wrote that account of the life of Jesus Christ. When I wrote that account, what I was really trying to do was to show people how I had been convinced that Jesus Christ truly was the Son of God. That's really the reason I wrote that whole book, was to convince people that he really was the Son of God. We've talked in the last couple of weeks about his miracle, well, quite a few weeks now, months actually, hasn't it been? We've talked about the miracles that he did, the people that he touched, the lives that he touched, and the teachings that he taught. We also talked about how after Peter had said, "Thou art the Christ," and declared him to be the Messiah of God, that Jesus' ministry changed to where he started teaching his disciples more and somewhat pulling away from the people. But at that point, we also talked about that Jesus had been determined to go to Jerusalem, where he knew his final fate, which would be death, would await him. And so in the last couple of weeks, actually last week, I guess it was, that we entered into the city. And with the shouts coming from the people, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which was a reference to Psalm 118 concerning him. And we'll talk a little bit more about that Psalm 118, in a reference to him as we talk about it today. But that day, the first day he came in, remember, we said that he came in after that great presentation. He went out of the city, and then he came back the next day. And on that day, when he came back on Monday, he came back. And on Monday was the day that he cleansed the temple. And on Tuesday, what awaited him was the scrutiny and the ire of the scribes, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Herodians. So I guess we left off last week when they started by asking him after he cleansed the temple on Monday, and they'd asked him the question. They said, "By what authority do you do this? And who gave you the right to do the things you do?" Which was, I think, they were really referencing the fact of how he came into the city on the colt, or the donkey, with the people shout saying, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," therefore proclaiming himself to be the Messiah, and at the same time not coming in any kingly way through the front entrances of the doors or the gates of Jerusalem. They're coming in through the gate of sacrifice, or the sheep's gate. But we talked about that last week, so we won't touch on that today. But they said, by what authority do you do this? And Jesus said, well, I'll answer your question if you answer my question. Was the baptism of John from men or from God? And remember last week, John the Baptist, we talked about that last week, and they didn't want to answer because if they said that it was of men, then the people were mad or would be mad because they considered John to be a prophet, an Old Testament prophet, which indeed he was the last Old Testament prophet. And if they said that if it was from God, then they would know that they would have been obligated, because it was from God, to heed John's warning and to rethink their position on their religious convictions and stance, and really almost in their self-righteous attitude, and that which they were portraying to the people. Well, they couldn't answer, so Jesus said, well, if that's the case, then I'm not going to answer your question either. But that kind of started this whole barrage of, or an encounter, arguments, really. I mean, not in a, well, I guess in a negative way, but in a positive way too, because Jesus used it to be able to, by way of example, to teach the people, and also to teach some of the scribes and Pharisees that had, I guess you would call it, ears to hear and eyes to see. So let me explain. As I said, Tuesday was a very difficult day for Jesus that week. And it was because he was grilled by them incessantly all day long. I'll give you a few examples. After this thing happened with John the Baptist, and the question he asked about John the Baptist, Jesus went on to tell a parable. And he was telling a parable about the religious leaders, which would be the scribes and the Pharisees. I guess you could include the Sadducees in that, but primarily the scribes and the Pharisees. He said, let me tell you what is going on here, and what your current understanding of the Jewish faith tradition is, and why it is that God's not pleased with it. He says, a man planted a vineyard. And the word planted, it started it. It was just bare ground, and he planted a vineyard. And he planted the vines. He put a hedge of protection around it. He put up a tower so that he could put guards up there that could watch to make sure no predators came in or to eat the fruits, animals came in to eat the fruits, and or people came in to steal anything from his vineyard. On top of that, not just a vineyard, but he also installed a wine press so that he could not just harvest the grapes when they came in, but he could actually vent the grapes, crush them, and by that, the product of the vineyard would be wine. So he put in a wine press, and he put in the vats. It would be very similar to what you know today in your society, which is the same thing, only there's more technology today if you were to go to a winery. Being in Northern California, we have arguably here in this place, or you have in this place, the greatest, one of the greatest winery areas of all the world, which would be Napa Valley, and all up through Northern and down into Southern California. It's great wine making country. So you understand when you talk about a vineyard and having walls around it and putting in the winery as well, all the accoutrements that come with that and go with that, of what it is that Jesus was talking about. So it's like saying, Jesus said, you know, a man took all that he had, all of his money, and he built a winery and his own vineyards so that he could vent his own grapes. And being the man that he was, what he wanted to do was employ some of the local people that were around there. So what he did was he rented out this winery to the people and this vineyard to the people, with a stipulation that when the harvest came in, they would be paid for what they did. When the harvest came in, they would get a certain amount of the profits. But he would also, because it was his winery, that he would be entitled to some of the profits as well. And it was a agreed-upon amount. Well, when the harvest came, the man that owned the winery said, I'm going to send one of my servants, and that way he can collect what is due. So he sent one of his servants to collect that, which the portion of the wine that was his. And when he got there, the people that had rented the vineyard from him said, well, we don't want to give him any of this profit. It should be our profit. We're the ones that worked it, and so therefore we're going to keep the profit. And so what they did was they beat the servant and they sent him away. Came back to the vineyard owner, and the vineyard owner said, well, I'll send another servant. So he sent another servant, and this one they beat, and actually they injured in the head. He sent a third one, and this one they killed. They took him outside the vineyard and they killed him. And this, trying to get what was due him, he kept sending different people. And as he sent different servants to him, they would abuse him and they would send them back and they wouldn't pay the wine owner what was due, the vineyard owner what was due. He said finally, well, as a last chance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send my heir. I'm going to send my son. And when I send my son, surely they're going to know that he's my heir, and there's not going to really be any misunderstanding. And because there's respect for me, I assume they'll have respect for my son. And so he sent his son, and they looked at his son and said, this is our opportunity. What we can do is we can kill him, and we can seize the winery for ourselves. So they took the son, and they killed him, and they cast him out of the vineyard. Then Jesus asked a question. He asked a question. In this parable, what do you think it is that the owner of the vineyard should do? And he answered and said, Jesus answered and he said, well, surely what he's going to do is he's going to cast them out of the vineyard, and he's going to cast them out and discipline them, where it's going to be to their destruction. And he's going to bring in new people that will take care of his vineyard. Well, the scribes and Pharisees, they kind of knew, but they didn't know that Jesus was talking about them. So what was it that Jesus was saying in that parable? Well, you see, the kingdom of God, the rule and reign of God, the administration of God's kingdom was given to the Jews. And there were the religious leaders that were the carriers of that, the priests, the Levites. There was the teachers. And what he said is that, you guys were teaching or supposed to be teaching the things of God. But what happened is you got away from the things of God and you started making it your religion and not God's religion. And so in that case, what happened was, because you wanted to be yours, I sent some prophets to correct you so you would redirect it back, in this case, to the owner of the vineyard. But what you decided to do was not to heed the prophets that I sent or the voices that I sent to tell the people, and to tell yourselves, to return to the precepts of God. And because of that, what happened is I sent prophets, you misused them, and you killed some of them. And finally, and Jesus talked about in the future, that the vineyard owner sent his son, and Jesus was talking about him being the son. What you're going to do to the son is you're going to kill the son, and you're going to cast him out of the vineyard. But what I want to tell you today is this, is you don't know it, but your days are over. I'm the last. I'm the last voice you're going to hear. If you don't heed what I have to say and listen to what I have to say, as the rightful heir of the vineyard, then you're going to be cast out of the vineyard and be destroyed. In other words, you're not going to tend the things of God anymore. But because you're going to kill me and you're going to cast me out, it will not be me in the long run that's cast out, but it will be you. What Jesus was signifying that day, prophetically to some extent, was basically saying that the days of Judaism were over. The days of the religious people of that day, of the Jews, was going to come to an end. It was going to come to an end in the killing of Jesus Christ. It all kind of fits when you think about what we're talking about this last week, about Jesus coming in by the sheep's gate by way of a sacrifice. It also shows the end of an era. Fits that when they kill Christ, what they're really doing is they're stopping. It's the very last of that era, of that eon, of that time, where everything would be administered by way of animal sacrifice and by way of sacrifice. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the Jews didn't like what Jesus had said, that there was going to be a new beginning, that they were going to be cast out. But they had these arguments already ready for him on that day because they were mad because he had cleansed the temple, which all of this fits into the ending of their system of belief in one sense. And so they had all these guys lined up that were going to inquire and to quiz Jesus to see if they couldn't trap him in something so that they could destroy him, kill him. That's what they ultimately wanted to do, and it was ultimately what they did do. So they sent a Pharisee or scribe I guess he was a scribe, and they sent a Herodian, which was a politician, because they were going to ask him a political question. And they get there and they said, well, Jesus, we have a question that we want to ask you. So there was a political figure there, and there was also the religious figures there. And they were trying to trap him because they knew if he could either make a mistake by way of religiously and not side on the Jews, that the people would be disgruntled with what he had to say. And yet if he stood with the people, then the political leaders would not be happy with him. So they knew that in the question they're going to ask, either the political leaders wouldn't be happy with him, that would be imminent of his death, or if he answered it the other way, this is in their thinking, that the people would be disgruntled with Jesus and they would turn on Jesus. So they said, is it profitable or is it right for a man to pay taxes to Caesar? Which Caesar, Rome, was the oppressors and the occupiers of the nation of Jerusalem at that time. And they were very brutal to the Jews. And let's face it, there was no love lost between the Jews and between the Romans. Now, like I said, if Jesus says, you've got to pay taxes, then the people would be mad. But if he said, well, they're here illegitimate, then the government would be mad. But Jesus had a way of answering that was extraordinary. He said, well, let me answer it this way. Bring me a coin, would you? So he brings a coin. He says, when you look at this coin, whose inscription is on it? Whose head is on it? Whose face is on it? And they said, and whose likeness and whose inscription, which was written that it was of the Roman Empire, minted by the Roman Empire. And he said, well, it's Caesar. It's Caesar's coin. It belongs to Caesar. It belongs to the social, secular government. And Jesus looked at the coin and looked at people and he said, well, if that's the case, why don't you render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, and to God the things that are God? Now I have to tell you, the people marveled. They marveled because what he had said was so profound. What he was saying, that in our society, there's certain obligations that we have to the government of our land. And up to that, and into that, we're to render to the government what's due the government. Because our very life is governed, and in some cases it's got the imprint of Caesar upon it. But then he kind of, in a very theological way, he says, but render to God the things that are God's, or of God. Well, if you think about it, man is made in the image and likeness of God. So what he was saying was, in some cases, the social stuff, the secular stuff, render what's due and what's right. Because his image is on the coins and oversees those things. But on your image, on who you are, you should render that to God. In other words, he was saying, that stuff will all take care of itself if you do what is right. But your main responsibility is to render to God those things that are God, which has to do with your life, your character, and where you're going. Well, after that, they thought they might trip him up another way since that didn't work. And there was some Sadducees there. And Sadducees were a group of religious people that didn't believe in anything that had to do with the supernatural. Much like our scientists today would be, that says God doesn't exist. Anything that doesn't exist in the cosmos that we can prove just simply doesn't exist. And so they thought they would trip him up on the resurrection. So they came to him and they said, well, we've got a question for you. And they said, a man marries a woman, and becomes his wife. And he passes away, and because they had no children, the next in line of the brothers has to marry that one. And they marry, and they have no children, and they have no offspring. And so the third brother, and ultimately there are 7 brothers, the first one dies, and the rest of them marry her, but none of them have any children. And then finally, after they die and she dies, they ask the question, whose wife will she be in the resurrection? So it's kind of complicated, but I don't want to go into it too deep. But let me explain it this way. Let's take it by way of my mother, who lived a long life. My mother married my father, and then my father died. And because my mother's life was so long, she remarried, and she remarried another man who became my stepfather. And he died. And then she didn't marry a third man, but she actually was in a significant relationship for an extended period of time to a third man. And he died. And she was still living. So what they're asking is, well, so when she dies, and if the resurrection is true, well, who is it that she's going to be with in heaven? Because she's got three. So she gets her and said, well, I didn't like my first husband that much. I loved my second one. The third guy was okay, so I guess I get to choose who I live with. And Jesus looked at that, and they were kind of saying, well, it doesn't make any sense, the idea of the fact that with these 7 brothers, that, how do you know who she's going to live with in that kind of a situation? And Jesus, looked at it and he thought, well, that's not really a very profound question, really, whatsoever. I mean, you think it's clever, but if you really think about it, it wasn't. And Jesus says, you're really wrong on 2 accounts. You're wrong on this account. First of all, when anybody dies, what happens is there is no marriage in the afterlife. And the reason that there's no marriage in the afterlife is because we don't or won't contain or have these physical bodies. So there won't be any procreation. There won't be any need anymore for a husband and wife relationship. Therefore, man will become like the angels, which signifies several things. That man would become, in one sense, a spiritual substance. And number 2, that angels don't procreate. They don't have little angels that are offspring. And the second thing he says is also concerning the resurrection, you greatly err on a second point. Basically, you said there is no resurrection. Because you remember what I said to Moses when he was at the burning bush, when he asked who I was, or who God was? And God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I am their existence. I created their existence. I am the one, and out of my essence, that they were created. Therefore, God is the God of the living and not the dead, which makes God living, but it also makes man a living being. That when he dies, his soul will survive that death and live on into eternity. He answered that question, and that was the Sadducees' question. And much to their chagrin, they walked away in defeat. And, that was a completely spiritual encounter that he had with them, a power encounter to some extent. But what Jesus was saying is the resurrection is going to happen. And what happens in the afterlife concerning marriage isn't really going to matter, because whatever God has in mind, it will be better and for a better or a more good purpose in the future. We just don't yet know what that is. Well, as Jesus was answering, there was this one scribe that was over there. And he just kept watching Jesus. And finally, he came up to Jesus, but he didn't come up in an arrogant way. He just kind of came up because he really had, maybe one of the first ones that didn't really want to challenge him, because he understood the wisdom of what Jesus was saying. He came up to Jesus and he said, I want to ask you a question. And Jesus said, okay. He said, what's the greatest commandment? Jesus looked at the man and he said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, all thy heart, all thy soul. No, the Lord thy God is one. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And there's a second one like it. And thou shalt love thy neighbor, even as thyself. And the man looked at Jesus and he said, you've answered correctly. You've answered well. And he wasn't trying to, at that point, he was just trying to understand where Jesus was coming from. And understood that Jesus was saying some very profound things. And then he said, surely you've answered well, because what you're saying is to love God and to love others is better than sacrifice. It's better than the blood of bulls, lambs, whatever the case might be. And Jesus looked at him and he said, you're not far away from the kingdom of God. He understood that this man understood that it's not in sacrifice that we find ourselves right with God. And actually what this scribe was really quoting or adding to what Jesus had said comes out of a couple of different places. in the Old Testament. One of them, I think in Micah, it says, he has shown thee, O man, what is good and what it is that the Lord requires of you, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. The thing that blew Jesus away about this man is that he answered him intelligently. He didn't answer him without reason. He didn't just try to pick a fight with him, but he was very curious. Now the scribe was still there, and the people had gathered around and heard these exchanges, and they were marveled at the teaching of Jesus. But it's like Jesus wanted to open up a little bit more to this scribe, and in the same time, teach the people. So he said, how is it that David, and he's going to be talking about himself, and he says, and I realize I'm bouncing around, but it just kind of all fits in the end if you'll bear with me. And he says, how is it that how is it that David said of his Lord that basically my Lord said, his Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make thy enemies a footstool for thy feet. And in doing that, David didn't just call him the son of David, but he called the one that would be the heir of David's throne his Lord. I know it's kind of a complex idea, but this is kind of what he was saying. You guys say that the Messiah, when he comes, will have to be a part of David's household, and he will. But what you're mistaken is the one that will come through the loins of David in the covenant established in the Davidic covenant, that the one coming will be the Messiah, and he will be greater than even David's son. What he was saying is, I'm a part of the genealogy of David, but make no mistake about it. I didn't come just to the loins of man, but I came and I was sent by God. Well, when that happened, he decided he was going to talk a little bit more about and explain what he was saying. So what he was saying was basically to this man, he said, you answered me correctly concerning the fact of this is the way that man should live. But to open up your eyes a little bit more, what I want you to see is that I wasn't just to extend your understanding of who I am and what it is that I'm teaching. I'm not just here to teach the principles of man or those that man should live by. But there's this part where you've got to realize that I'm the Messiah and that I'm sent by God. And that's why the scribe is talking to people. I'm teaching you the things that I'm teaching. And so he gets done with that, and he has two more small stories to tell. He said, let me tell you another thing. You're a scribe and you're here with me. But I want to tell you something. There's something I see in you that doesn't fit the religious persona of the other scribes that are around, or the religious leaders, or the Pharisees. So I want to tell you that because you're close to the kingdom of heaven, if you can understand that I was sent by God and not just by the loins of David, and if you can avoid, and he's talking about now, the pitfalls of the other scribes and Pharisees. And their pitfall is their own spiritual pride. You came to me with a legitimate question, but in their pride, they want to destroy me. So if you want to follow me, you want to be a part of my teaching and my kingdom, then what it is important for you to avoid the appearance of the scribes and Pharisees, who love to wear their long robes with all of their tassels so they look important, have the seat of honor, pray the long prayers that everybody wants them to pray, as if they're pious people. And at the same time, all they do is make the widow destitute. He said, stay away from them, and you'll do well. And then he goes further with just a small story, as he's standing there and looking across at people giving money in the treasury. And he sees this group of scribes and Pharisees that are over there making a loud noise when they give money in order to look pious. And he sees an old woman walk over there, and she puts in 2 small coins. Jesus looking at the people, his disciples, and the scribe who's wanting to understand what Jesus is saying, and Jesus is trying to instruct him. And he says, you see that woman over there that put in those 2 coins? She gave more than all those scribes and Pharisees that gave their money combined and put together. You see, because they gave out of their excess. They gave out of what they had and could give. But she had 2 coins, and she gave it all because she was trusting God. You see, scribe, it goes back to what you were talking about when you asked me what the greatest command was. And after answering that, you said that God desired something, and that would be love more than he did sacrifice. The sacrifice of bulls, sheep, animals. And this woman shows what it is to be a true follower of God. Because she gave all that she had. And in giving all that she had, she simply is trusting God. What I'm telling you to the scribe and teaching the disciples and the people is you can boil down all of this to simply this: loving God, loving yourself, and loving others. And the rest will take care of itself. Now, this vineyard is going to be taken away from the scribes and Pharisees that I've talked about. But you, if you can avoid those pitfalls, and you can become like this woman and give all you have to God, you're not only close to the kingdom of heaven, but you enter into the kingdom of heaven. Well, those are just a few stories that Jesus told, but they're profound, really. Jesus was saying, the day of Judaism, the day of sacrifice, is going to come to an end when those that are in the vineyard that want to seize the vineyard for themselves kill me and cast me out of the vineyard. But it won't be me who dies. It won't be God that will be shamed. It will be them. And because of me and because of my death, there will be a new beginning. But there'll be a new beginning because I'm the Messiah of God. And that's why David called me Lord. And with that as well, I'm telling you that it's important for you to avoid all the trappings of religion and just give all you have to God. And you'll find that you're not just close to the kingdom of God, but you've entered in. The answer to that, or to the question that Jesus would ask, and the answer would be, obviously, yes, but the question is do you want to participate with God on that level? Do you want to give yourself? Do you want to be a person of religious pride and have all of your traditions of men, not necessarily of God, and have the best seats, say the longest prayers, be known as a person of honor, be a famous person, a wealthy person? If so, that might be mutually exclusive to what God has in the kingdom of heaven. But if you humble yourself and give all you have, love God and love others, you find yourself there. Those are just a few examples of what Jesus shared. I'm going to close with that. But that Tuesday was very, very difficult as there was many more questions and many more things that was happening. To set up for next week, here's what happened. Jesus got up from the temple, and as he was walking out that day, exhausted and tired, as he was walking out, one of the disciples said, "Isn't this a beautiful place with all of its grandeur?" And Jesus looked upon it, and at that point declared that that temple would soon be destroyed and never really to be rebuilt. We'll talk more about that next week as we talk about Jesus talking about the future and what the future would look like after the destruction of the temple, which would come in 70 AD, just shortly after his life was over. I want to thank you for joining me, and I hope today you've learned something about the life of Jesus and also how it might apply to your life. To do as that scribe was really interested in it when he understood he had shown thee, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of thee, but to do justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. I hope you say yes to do that, and I hope that you employ that in your everyday life. Thank you, and have a great day. God bless.